Just before we hear from our speakers, I'd like to just lay out a little bit of context. Um, our lake water quality is fragile. The Rideau Valley Conservation Authority's subwatershed report in 2014 rated our water quality on Upper Rideau Lake as poor. So we've been working with other lake associations and our township Mayor Hugenboom and councillors to adopt a lake health approach in the new township official plan to improve water quality. So in simple terms, to help get there, what we're trying to do is we're trying to link science, the results on water quality, we're trying to link science to our lake. We're trying to link science to our members, and we're trying to link science to the policies and decisions taken by our municipal governments. Not too complicated, that's what we're trying to do. And so today, given the people that we have, our mayors, our councillors, and Dr. Smol, today is a small but important step along this road. Dr. Smol will tell us about emerging science and how it affects our lake, among others. So let's now move to listen to Dr. Smol. Dr. John Smol is a very eminent scientist, a distinguished Queen's University professor. He is president of the Academy of Science, Royal Society of Canada. These are just two of the many, many roles he serves. In short, Dr. John Smol is simply one of the world's great lake scientists. In the spring, when we asked Dr. Smol about speaking to us today, he said he had been planning to speak in Switzerland, but the virus had changed his plans. So he very generously said yes, and I have to tell you, I was absolutely thrilled, so thank you. His research bears directly on the water quality and what we're seeing on Upper Rideau Lake now and in the future. His scientific findings are why we have him to speak to us today. So, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I think I can share my screen now, I think. Okay, let's see. And I think everyone would see my screen now. Is that correct? Are you seeing it? Oh, perfect.
Right.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here. I represent a large group of scientists here at Queen's University. My lab is called PEARL, the Paleolimnological Environmental Assessment and Research Lab, and it's actually a group of about 40 people working on lakes around the world. We work on lakes in Ontario, but we actually work on all 7 continents. And we work on a wide spectrum of issues, not just local Ontario issues. We work on large climate change issues, road salt, how human activities affect lakes, and how different is this from natural conditions. And what I want to get across here in my talk is the importance of timescales and what a complicated world we're in. And because I only had 20 minutes for my talk, I've narrowed it down primarily to one problem, which I know is on the radar screen in the entire Rideau Lake systems, algal blooms, and also climate warming, which we now see are very clear connections between the two. Okay, what am I doing here? So we all love lakes, we all love rivers. We often refer to this as ecosystem services, everything from the right there from drinking water to agriculture and to a whole hydropower and a whole spectrum of recreational activities, angling, and so on and so forth. Notwithstanding how important fresh water is to all our lives, we live in a very complicated world. We live in a world where we have things we might refer to as point sources. And these are relatively easy to control because it's coming from one point. But we also have more diffuse sources, either coming via the air or sometimes by the catchment, golf courses, even cottagers who are not maintaining their lawns properly, overfishing. We're doing a lot of things to our waters, and we often have unintended consequences. And one of the biggest challenges we have in environmental and ecological work is timescales. When we have an environmental the questions we ask are very similar to what the questions a medical doctor asks when you're not feeling well and you go to the doctor. What we really need to know when we're dealing with lake conditions is what were pre-disturbance conditions? What were conditions like before we think the stresses are there? And the doctor asks you that, he's asking for your medical history. Partly he or she is trying to establish, are you really sick? Now, I cut my teeth on acid rain, and this was a classic example where you had to know pre-disturbance conditions. You could go to Algonquin Park or Adirondack Park south of us in New York and take the acidity levels of the waters. You could say it's acid, but how do you know it was acid rain that caused the lakes to be acid? Arguments were made from industry that it was all natural or it was all because of trees and so on and so forth. We had to be able to reconstruct not what the pH is today, but how acid it was in the early 1800s. You need long-term data. No one was monitoring in the early 1800s. You want to know what is the range of natural variability. Climate change is a good example. No one can deny that something remarkable has happened with our climate, but the argument has been made by some that, yeah, but that's just part of natural variability. You need long-term data. Have conditions changed? How much? How fast? When? Why? Each of these questions has a time component associated with it. And that's one of the biggest challenges we have in lake work. We need to know when conditions changed and what was the cause. And we have to know what's natural. If you have a lake that always had algal blooms going back to the Ice Age, that sort of changes what your target is. And here's the biggest challenge we have, I think. I just published this last year, but I went to an international journal, Environmental Monitoring and Assessment, and I asked how long are most monitoring programs? And about 2/3 are less than 1 year in duration, and over 90% are less than 3 years in duration. You can get a lot of answers in 3 years or less of data, but if you think of the questions I posed in the previous slide, 3 years or less of data is very difficult to use to answer some of those broad questions. So there's ways we try and push the monitoring record back in time. It'd be ideal if someone was measuring phosphorus and chlorophyll A and nitrogen in the 1700s in Upper Rideau Lake, but they weren't. So the alternative we have is what's called paleolimnology. And I have 40 people in my lab do that. So it sounds esoteric, but it's actually quite a large group. And there's groups now around the world. We're the largest, but there's groups around the world. And the overall process is fairly straightforward. It says that the mud at the bottom of a lake is a time machine. So 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year, mud is slowly accumulating at the bottom of the lake, coming from outside the lake itself, things like pollen grains, contaminants, soil particles from erosion, and also within the lake. All the organisms living in the lake, things like the algae, the small animals, the small invertebrates, the small insect larvae, they all have fossils that slowly accumulate at the bottom of the lake. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, there's a slow accumulation. And for a place like Upper Rideau Lake, the record goes back 12,000 years. It goes back to the last ice age. When the ice age left 12,000 years ago, the clock started. The lake filled with water and it started accumulating history. So we can go back 12,000 years in Upper Rideau Lake. For the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to go back 200 years because just that's what the time measure. And that's the only data I have for Upper Rideau Lake. And it also goes back 30 years when I was a very young man. One of my first projects was looking at some of the Rideau lakes. But this is what we do. We reconstruct the history. Now, so how do we do that? Well, we do that by we have to remove the history book. So in Upper Rideau Lake, we'd need about 50 centimeters of sediment to go back about 200 years. Now, I'm not saying the record is perfect. You know, it can be mixed and so on, but we have ways of identifying what that record is. So what is here? This is actually taking a core in Lake Opinicon, not too far from Upper Rideau Lake. And this is one of the glue cores developed in my lab. And you appreciate the surface sediments in the deep water are very watery. So you have to be very careful how you take that history book. But this is like a time machine. The very surface, if I took that core this weekend, that would be 2020. And then as I go deeper down, it's older and older and older. We have independent ways of saying how old it is. And I'll show you that in a quick slide coming up. If we're going back thousands of years, we can radiocarbon, C14 data, but we use different methods here. So we can say that's about the 1930s, that's about the 1880s, for example. Here's a close-up of that core. So it's like a time capsule. And you look at that sediment, and it looks like mud, and it is mud, but in that sediment is an incredible rich history of what happened in the lake and outside the lake. Pollen grains from the trees are preserved, so we can reconstruct when agriculture came. We can reconstruct when they cut down trees. We can reconstruct climate change. Virtually everything living in the lake is leaving some sort of fossil. So if you can reconstruct what the algae were, how many algal blooms you had, all these things, if you can reconstruct by the fossils, you can reconstruct a decent history of the lake. Then we take the sediment core, and here we're sectioning at 0.25 centimeters at a time. So that's about 2 or 3 years of lake history. Every time, so we push it from the bottom. As you realize the sediment is very wet, so we have to be very careful how we do this. But it's being pushed from the bottom, the core, and we slowly scrape off a quarter centimeter. Each time we're going back in time. Deeper we go, the older it gets. And so here is the sediment core I took. And then here is what we did. I put, instead of saying 0 centimeters and 50 centimeters, look at that. I've got 1890, 1965, how do I know that? Well, we have independent ways of dating the sediments. I won't get into any of the technical details, but there's a natural occurring isotope, lead-210. And if we measure how much lead-210 is in the core, we can actually estimate what the dates are. So we can say that's about 1990, that's about 1972, that's about 1870. So to put a Canadian context, that's where Canada became a country, 1867 down here. That's the last time the Toronto Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup. There's a lot of sediments accumulated since then. And here's the overall approach. You select a lake, you take a sediment core like I just showed you, section it, you date it, you look at all the fossils. It's a very long step on the microscope, and then you analyze the data. This sounds very qualitative, very hit and miss, but this is actually a pretty precise science with a lot of mathematical modeling going on. So we're looking at hundreds of indicators of these fossils that are in lake sediments. So there's many things we can do with paleolimnology. I'm going to focus here, we look at anoxia, climate change, acidification, fire history. I'm going to focus on algal blooms, a problem that I know you're most concerned with. And again, what we can do with this record, we can look at targets. What is natural in these lakes? If the lake is naturally somewhat productive, naturally had algal blooms, it can temper what you might want to do with your backgrounds. And trajectories. At what point in time, was there a certain number of cottages before you had a problem? Was it a certain change in treatment facilities when your problem started getting better? We can do that because we can now provide the long-term data. So this is what a lot of people I know in the Rideau Lakes are worried about. This is actually from not a Rideau Lake, but I know we've seen algal blooms like this. Algal blooms cause all sorts of problems, especially if they're blue-green algal blooms. They're so-called cyanobacteria. And there are a lot of problems, and they typically comes from too much nutrients. A farmer puts fertilizer on a field to grow crops. If that fertilizer goes into the water, it grows plant-like matter in the lake, and that's what causes problems. If you have too many nutrients coming from sewage or from fertilizer, you have algal blooms, macrophyte, what we call macrophyte growth, shoreline fouling. You get taste and odor problems. Some of these blue-green algae have medical issues. I mean, they have toxins. They have taste, and it doesn't look nice. It lowers property values. The water tastes and smells bad. And as the algae die and decay and go in the deep water, it starts, you lose oxygen in the deep water. It can kill fish. That's why you sometimes get fish kills. And it's basically no one likes algal blooms. And so that is a major issue. And we understand quite a lot about algal blooms. A key factor is nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, especially phosphorus. And we figured that out. Well, I didn't figure it out, but it was figured out before my time, mainly in the late 1970s. And that became clear. You need nutrients, and that's why we have these phosphorus guidelines for lake. If you go past a certain phosphorus level, which comes from sewage, which comes from fertilizer, comes from some natural sources, if you pass a certain level, you're probably going to get algal blooms. And we've known that for some time. The challenge is we now know some lakes do not have increasing nutrient levels. In fact, many lakes have decreasing nutrient levels, and we're still getting algal blooms. In fact, we might be getting even more algal blooms. Why is that? Well, here are the things we really need to know. This is what a regular limnologist, a regular lake biologist would want. They want to know nutrient levels, what's the phosphorus levels. They want to know what the deep water oxygen levels are, and they want to know what's the frequency of algal and blue-green algal blooms. Well, we can actually track all of these in the sediment record. I'm going to focus mainly on tracking these two, lake water nutrient levels and cyanobacteria blooms. I didn't have time to talk about oxygen, but we have ways of doing that as well. So how do we track nutrient levels? Well, first of all, here's the problem. Just to show you, this is by Jenny Winter, who is a scientist with Ontario Ministry. But sure enough, algal blooms are increasing. These are the reports of algal blooms across Ontario lakes, and many of these lakes are actually declining in phosphorus. So this is the conundrum, if we like. And I'm sure you know this area very well. I'm going to talk about the Rideau Lake system. I'm going to use some very old data I have from Upper Rideau Lake. And many of you are much more familiar with Upper Rideau Lake than I am, but Upper Rideau Lake does have a significant environmental history. And I am going to talk about one group of fossils. There's many things we look at in sediments, but our specialty is diatoms. That's a type of algae. So blue-green algae or cyanobacteria, that's one type of algae. Here's another type of algae. These are diatoms. Now they look big, but they're magnified. You could put hundreds on the head of a pin. But these are different species of diatoms. Different species, different types of algae have different requirements. Some like acid water, some like alkaline water, some like salty water, some like fresh water, some like high phosphorus water, some like low phosphorus water. This is what I'm going to use here. And we use them as indicators. It's just like if I showed you a polar bear, you know you're in the Arctic. You know you're not in the Antarctic, there's no polar bears in the Antarctic. You know you're in the Arctic. You know it's cold. You know it's near the ocean because the polar bear eats seal. If I showed you a camel, you'd know it's dry, you're in the desert. Well, it's the same thing with these. There's hundreds of these species. These are highly magnified under the microscope. Oh, there's hundreds of these species, and different species mean different things. Like this Cyclotella here lives in very clean, nutrient-poor water. This Olacosyra needs higher nutrients, lives in more productive waters, for example. This Cymbella lives in very shallow water, for example. And I know these are impossible to see, but this is a very old figure. It's over 30 years ago. So it's, you know, we're going to record the lake. But this is how we show our data. I'm just going to quickly show you what the parameters here. And I'm going to show you very quickly 3 points of the graph. This is a core that I said is 50 centimeters deep, okay? We did the Letu 10 data. We took that core in 1989, so that tells you something. And the core goes down to 1800s. That's about 1918. You see, we have dates at various times down here. Recall the Rideau Canal was built here. You see also a color change in the sediments. And this is the percentages of different species of fossils. And you can see, going back 200 years, at a certain periods of time, these fossils were very common. Then they almost disappeared. Then these fossils were common. Well, I'll quickly go through this very briefly. We see here what Upper Rideau Lake was before the Rideau Canal. I'm sure all of you know about the building of the Rideau Canal, but you can see there's very different fossils before the Rideau Canal was built. And these fossils indicate that the lake was naturally somewhat productive, but far less productive than it is now. It would have been what we call oligomesotrophic, but it was never a swimming pool. You know, it was never as clear as a swimming pool. It always had a significant amount of nutrients. And I can tell that because I see Stephaniscus niger. I know that requires a fair amount of nutrients, but this Cyclotella requires low nutrients. This is a signal of low nutrients. So before the Rideau Canal came in, it was a fairly clean lake. Then came the building of the Rideau Canal. It resulted in flooding of shallow areas, cutting down trees and everything. And we see a big change in fossils. And we see a change in fossils that are indicating flooding. They raised the water level 1.5 meters, so about 4 or 5 feet. That flooded a lot of area. And so you made a lot of these shallower water areas. Suddenly we have these shallower water diatoms, and also diatoms that indicate higher nutrient conditions. So the Rideau Canal was pretty well the biggest thing that ever happened in Upper Rideau Lake in the last 200 years. And I'm sure you all know about the Rideau Canal, but it was built by Lieutenant Colonel By. And it's important to see how much disruption the canal did. Never mind they raised water levels. It's quite amazing. They did this in the 1830s. But you can see this is near Kingston Mills. Look at the devastation of the land around it. In fact, here's a painting of Upper Rideau Lake from around 1832. You can see almost all the trees had been cut down even then. So it's not surprising we had erosion, even with the canal erosion and then flooding of lands, we had a big change. Then we see another change happening about, and this is typical of many Ontario lakes, where we say post-World War II increase in nutrients. A lot of commercial fertilizers were available, more cottages were almost everywhere, and we see an increase of enhanced eutrophications, things like Olachrosarga granulata. Now this core ends in the late 1980s. And what we showed was into the 1980s, nutrient levels were high. And in fact, what little nutrient data we have from the 1970s and 1980s does show that it's higher, the nutrients were higher then than they are today in Upper Rideau Lake. The available data I found from the Ministry of Environment is it's about in the 30s, high 20s and 30s, which is higher than the measurements are today. So that's the story up until 30 years ago. We have to take a new core to find out what's happened in the last 30 years. That study I showed you was using very old techniques. We've moved a long way since then. And it was one of the first studies I ever did as a 20-something-year-old professor. So we are going to go back and do more analyses in the future with much more new techniques. But what's happened since the 30 years? Well, what's happened in the previous 30 years, we've been warming the planet much more faster. And I called it a threat multiplier. It's really causing a lot more problems in a lot more areas. And I'm just going to show you what we think is happening. I want to start by saying nutrients are key. I gave a version of this talk once, and then someone says, so phosphorus and nitrogen's not important. Oh, no. Nothing happens without the nutrients. So it's talking about a shift of emphasis. But without question, the phosphorus and nitrogen, if you don't have it, you're not going to get algal biomass. However, people are recording increased algal blooms even in lakes with steady or often even declining nutrient levels. Something is shifting on the planet. And we asked the question, can climate change be affecting algal blooms even without increase in nutrients? And we think it is. We've been calling it the longer summer. One thing that's very clear is there's less and less ice cover. Each year seems to be less and less ice cover. The summer has gotten longer. There's a longer period of time for algae to develop, especially in August and into September when it's still hot. Also, we have enhanced thermal stratification. I'm sure many of you know this. If you're out treading water in the middle of the lake and sometimes your toes feel really cold, that's because the deeper water is quite a bit colder, but the warmer water is lighter, so it floats on top. Blue-green algae cyanobacteria love the longer summer. Cyanobacteria, blue-green algae love more stratified conditions. And so what do we think we're seeing is a shift with climate warming to these problem algae that we see. I'll give you an example very quickly. Lake of the Woods. It's a much different lake from Upper Rideau. It's really almost a great lake. It's a large lake with lots of bays. But look what's been happening to the phosphorus. They had a very effective phosphorus abatement program from the 1960s, of very high phosphorus loads to very low phosphorus loads. Yet, since the last 20 years, 25 years, residents are saying we're seeing more blue-green algal blooms, especially in August and September. How does this make sense? We've removed phosphorus and we're seeing all these blue-green algal blooms. So there's a perception algal blooms have increased, yet we know the phosphorus has decreased. What's been happening? Well, again, these diagrams are impossible to read, but here's a 125-year record of one bay in Lake of the Woods. Without going into detail, you see a tremendous change in fossils happened in the late 1970s. This lake has gone through a tremendous shift since the 1970s. And that's exactly when the algal bloom started. And what we're seeing is algae that like cold, well-mixed conditions going to algae that like the longer summer, just like the blue-green algae. And here, it's hard to see this, but when we see this fossil, this summer-loving fossil increase, you can see it's matching air temperatures very clearly. The one that likes the cold temperature is totally opposite to the air temperatures. This is ice out, even clearer. It's really ice is the key. We're making the longer summer. As there's less and less ice, you can see the increase in the warm loving. As there's less and less ice, you see a decrease in the cold loving. Well, that's matching the algal blooms. Have the algae increased at time? Here's fossil chlorophyll A. So here we are reconstructing algal blooms in 3 different bays. Here's one. What's key is the current nutrient. If they're over 10, it looks like you have a problem. Here's Echo Bay. It has a total phosphorus of 14. You can see a clear increase in algal blooms over recent time. Here's one a little lower. It's 12. It's a little messier, but a slight increase. Here is one that's less than 10, an oligotrophic bay. And here, if nutrients are low enough, it has to pass a threshold, but that threshold's pretty low. 10 is pretty low. And this is the problem. We're pushing it towards blue-greens. Blue-greens like it hot. Before, in the 1970s, when there was less ice cover and so on and so forth, you had this situation. You had a well-mixed, cool, slightly cooler, but it's a threshold response. When it got warmer, you got the lake stratified, and that's exactly when you start exasperating the blue-green algal blooms, even without further increases in nutrients. So we think this is a serious issue. I'll just give you one slide. It's not just algal blooms. If you're warming the planet and you're increasing algal blooms, you've got more material going down in the deep water. And with warming, you're squeezing out the deep water fish. So this is what it was like maybe in the 1970s. When you make the summer longer, it's a longer period of time, and you also start stressing out your deep water fish. So it has other implications that we don't see. We tend to see what's on the surface, which is an algal bloom, but a lot is happening inside the lake. And the list is getting bigger. I'm just talking about climate and nutrients. There's growth, salt. I was an author on this paper, but we listed about 15 new problems we have to deal with. So what's the lessons from the past? I'll just end with this slide. The recurring pattern of unintended consequences. We are seeing a lot of things happening with climate warming, and everything I'm seeing, that's why I call it the threat multiplier. Everything's getting worse with it. And we tend to be overly optimistic. Things are generally worse and more complicated than we initially imagined. When I started my career, you worked on algal blooms, or you worked on acid rain, or you worked on forest fires. We now realize you can't silo that kind of work. Everything is happening at once, and generally, it's much more serious when you add these problems together. So just to end. Normally, I think you think of monitoring, which is most of the data we have. If you think of paleoecology, you often think of millennia or maybe centuries. But with these new approaches, we're dovetailing the 2 approaches. And that's usually, it's back in history where many of the answers remain that we need for these studies. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Smol. Steve, Mark, do we have any questions coming in?
I haven't seen any questions coming at all at this point.
I have a question. If there was one thing that a cottage owner, John, or a property owner could do to make a difference, what would that be?
Yeah. So, we can do things locally, and it's very hard, especially with issues like climate change, to say, what can I do? But locally with nutrient situation, pay strict rules to the Ministry of Environment guidelines. We've got to decrease. So a net result of what I just said here is that, we might have to bring the phosphorus levels even lower to keep algal blooms away. The old guidelines may have to be shifted lower, because we're getting blooms now. Before, you'd often say over 20 or over 25 parts per billion phosphorus. Now it might be 15, which is a very much more difficult target to get. So anything you can do to decrease nutrients into the lake will decrease the amount of algal blooms. So everything from good management of your, especially lakefront property, keeping buffer zones, not fertilizing your lawn, keeping it as natural as you can, keeping all the septic systems as natural as you can, not using products, just trying to do everything you can. And you know, a lot of the nutrients we've gotten pretty good control in most places, what we call point sources when they're coming from one point. It's these what we call diffuse sources, you know, coming from agriculture, coming from land, which is people's lawns, if nothing else. We've paved a lot of the world, so the water comes down very quickly. This is another climate issue I didn't have time to talk about, but what we call about episodic weather. We have much more intense short-range storms. You know, we don't have anything happening, and then we have this intense storm coming. That's when a lot of nutrients can come in because there's so much erosion, there's so much water flowing over land, it's picking up stuff. So we're realizing that even a few of these storms can bring in so much more phosphorus than before, where we had like rain every few days or something. So that's the local thing, you know, and realizing we have to keep the real strict rules on nutrients. And then the other issue is we all got to work on climate change. This is a very, very serious problem. People do not. I always keep thinking if people really had a good grasp of how serious human-induced climate change is, they'd be rioting in the streets asking for action. But that's a much more difficult problem. It's a global problem. And there we have to do individually everything we can to decrease greenhouse gases, including what we do locally, what we do provincially, nationally, globally, and also keep the pressure on politicians that can make decisions that this is a priority issue. I have the gray hair, I'm going to make it, but I'm sure many of you have children and grandchildren, and that's who's going to pay the price. Every time we delay with climate change, it's much harder to clear the problem.
So, John, we have a number of questions here, and Art, do you want to
Please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, we have a few questions here. The first one is from Janet Purchase. Her question is, has the presence or decline of zebra mussels in the lake had any effect on the algae blooms?
That's a very, very good question. I didn't have time to get into that. I can't answer specifics about Upper Rideau because I haven't really worked on it about 20, 30 years, you know, but I can talk in a broad sense. In many lakes, yes, in many lakes, the zebra mussel and other exotic quagga mussel, they're extremely efficient filters, extremely efficient. And in fact, one zebra mussel can filter 1 liter of water every day. And so you've seen how many zebra mussels you can see out there. That is, certainly it decreases the amount of phytoplankton. Now, it may not decrease the amount of cyanobacteria. It depends what they're eating, you know. But it's because many cyanobacteria that are causing the problems are filament, not all, microcystis is a small one, but you see anabina, or they have new names now, but they're big filaments, and that's what they're often not eaten by many things. That's one of the reasons they survive in late summer, because nothing's eating them too. But definitely zebra mussels in general have decreased lake water chlorophyll A levels. Now they may independently increase algal material in the shallow waters because they call it a shunt, a nutrient. So they're filtering plankton, what's in the open water, and when they say remove their feces or whatever from the shell, it's putting the nutrients into the benthos, let's say the deep the shallow water area. So it actually can cause maybe more issues in shallow waters of benthic algae, for example. But you're right. No, zebra mussels is definitely, and other mussels that are invasive, generally decrease overall algal production, but may not decrease cyanobacteria because a lot of things don't like eating cyanobacteria.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the next two questions are maybe somewhat related. You may have already kind of answered it, but I'll still ask them. So first one here is from Dennis and Joan Duncan. Given what you've told us about our lake's history and the impact of climate change, what can we do individually and collectively to support our lake so that it can continue to be enjoyed by our children, grandchildren, and generations to come?
Yeah, I think if any message, and if science is always moving, science is self-correcting, we're continually gaining data. And again, I preface this by saying the last time I worked on Upper Rideau Lake is when I had a lot more hair and it was a different color. Anything you can do to decrease nutrient input is important, because I think, as I said, if anything, I think the thresholds before when you get an algal bloom is declining in nutrients. So that makes we probably need more stringent nutrient based on the data, the preliminary data I'm showing you here. and others are showing similar things. So again, anything you can do to decrease nutrients, that includes legislation, but it includes on your own cottages, especially lakefront cottages, don't fertilize the lawn. Have as big a buffer zone between, by buffer zone, I mean, so you don't have erosion coming in. Try and stop when we have these episodic storms. That would include trying to find, it just doesn't, all the water, it doesn't flow in with a whole bunch of soil that's rich in fertilizer, rich in phosphorus and nitrogen. So we really have to be vigilant. I think even though nutrient levels may have gone down, algal blooms, because of all these things happening, may be increasing. So we just got to keep that threshold as low as possible. Algae need nutrients. So if they don't, I want to keep emphasizing nutrients are still key, but we've shifted the algal biomass to the ones we hate, the cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae. Cyanobacteria, blue-green algae are the same thing. The blue-green algae that you see, especially in August when that summer's gotten longer. Anything we can do to cut down nutrients. And of course, climate change, as I said, we got to keep vigilant with politicians and everyone saying this is a priority item that we have to keep dealing with.
So I think you sort of answered. I'm going to jump ahead one question from Ann Carter. She asked, is removing algae during a bloom an effective way of removing nutrients from the lake? I think you sort of basically just had answered that, but would you say that's the most effective way then? Would be removing the nutrients?
Algae? Did you say removing algae?
Removing algae, yes.
Yeah, you see, the thing is, it's very hard to remove algae. I mean, algae is sort of the net result of all this problem. Collecting algae is almost impossible to do because we don't have filters that actually remove them. Algae, and most of them you don't see. The things you see when you have an algal bloom are the ones that have come just to the surface. But what we tend to look at lakes, we live in a world of 2 dimensions, but lake is 3 dimensions, it goes deep. So it's really what you'd have to do is remove the nutrients that cause the algae and do all you can with climate change. So often that is indirect ways of removing the nutrients. It's things like better lawn practices, better sewage treatment, or whatever system you're using. But actually physically removing algae is very hard to do. Now they are trying to do it in China in some areas. I go to work with Chinese too, and they actually have these big plants where they're trying to take the blue-greens right out of the lake, and this is a big operation, and sell it as fertilizer. Now there's some issues with that because the blue-green algae also pick up contaminants, but they're trying to find a market for blue-green algae, but that's a fairly big operation.
So there was a question,
Mark,
sorry, that I skipped ahead. Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, 2 or 3 more questions.
Sure.
If that's okay.
Yeah, so sorry, the one that I skipped over was basically just what resources might be available for people that would like to get involved or to raise awareness for their neighbors, that type of thing.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, we, the Lake Association, we can try and help with that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I assume you're part of FOCA, the Federation of Ontario Cottagers Association. I think they have some resources for sure. The Ontario Ministry, so lakes in Canada, unless they're international waterways, primarily is under provincial control. There's the self-help program, which I think, a self-sampling program, which I think Upper Rideau may be on. I'm not sure.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's an important way. And education, and some of it comes down to municipal laws. Now, of course, there's complexities with lakes, especially, just to clarify, there's complexities in that water moves. It comes from different places, and you're part of almost like a river system. Now you're at the Upper Rideau Lake is sort of a headwater there because you're flowing, I think, in both directions, going to Ottawa, going back to Kingston.
Right.
But of course, anything that flows into the lake from other lakes is also can possibly affect you. The provincial government has a variety of health programs, but Cottagers Association are important. FOCA has literature and guidebooks on cottager manuals and so on and so forth. I think that's all part of the solution.
Great. We think one more question, John, or?
Yeah. One more.
Okay. Okay, so let's see. Here's one from Karen Strandon. You mentioned, you ended your talk by mentioning road salt. Can you describe how road salt affects the conditions in the lake?
Yeah, this is very new work we're doing. I've done some old work, but at that point it wasn't on the radar screen. road salt can affect, we're still not certain how it affects, but road salt, if you look, we use a fair, Ontario uses a lot of road salt, Canada does, and there's reasons for it, for safety. You know, it's one of those things, you know, you got to weigh it. You want people living in winter not getting killed, but it also, road salt has some environmental consequences. We can see in many lakes slowly, very slowly, road salt concentrations in lakes slowly increasing. We don't have enough data, and it's going slowly, but it's a trend that we see, and you wouldn't see that in sampling 3 years. You know, you got to do it like decades and decades of paleolimnology, what we're doing. It does affect especially the little animals, it looks like, what we call cladoscans. People call them often water fleas. It's that little animals you see swimming around. They're very important in eating algae. They eat algae. And if they are detrimentally affected, that could be yet another reason to cause algal blooms. On top of that, typically, cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, can live in much higher salt waters, often, you know, can survive in many of these waters. We don't have enough information yet on it, but definitely it just keeps incrementally increasing in many lakes every year. And we're now showing some data showing quite remarkable changes, especially in the little animals. And that could end up being just one more. It's really, you know, it's 1,000 cuts. You know? It's all these things, and usually they're cumulative. You know, sometimes you think they cancel each other out, but everything I'm talking about here often tends to lead to more algal blooms.
All right.
John, that was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
It's a bit, gives us lots of things to reflect on, and we very, very much appreciate the depth of science that you have brought here today. I was conscious as you were speaking, it's like an iceberg, and I only actually understand the very, very top. So thank you very much.